This video will contain spoilers for Jujutsu Kaisen chapters 123, 124, and 125, and Season 2, Episode 19, otherwise known as Episode 43. So the second season of Jujutsu Kaisen is still struggling with a moral quandary, and in this series I'm going to be analyzing the story of the series as it airs and, as a manga reader, comparing the anime to the manga to see what they pulled over directly, what they modified or expanded, and what they just straight up removed. So let's begin with the 19th episode of Season 2 of Jujutsu Kaisen. First, I'll recap the plot and explain what chapters it covered. The episode begins with a quick flashback to when Nobara and Nita separated after our dearly departed Nanami asked them to stay put. Nobara has handed Nita off to emergency staff, and she implores Nobara not to head back into the fray, pointing out that they didn't make it known to her Shoko was nearby to keep her from doing something reckless. But Nobara refuses to leave the others behind when they're still fighting. The flashback ends and we resume the battle between Yuji and Mahito, as he continues torturing Yuji by using innocent civilians as ammunition. We cut away to the battle between Nobara and Mahito, as he notices that she's taking extra care to avoid his hands. He points out that it's pointless to do so, as this clone can't actually manipulate souls other than his own, which he'll take advantage of to wear her down faster. And, since he's not fighting Yuji, he can safely manipulate his own body to fight her. They continue their scuffle, and Mahito reminds Nobara again that regular attacks won't be able to hurt him. She feeds him a line about trying anyway, which he regards as lame, and then Nobara sets up her trap. Seizing the high ground, then using hairpin to set up some nails, and then pierce his legs to momentarily immobilize him, she drops onto him, springing her trap and revealing that she's been curious to see if her technique works on him ever since she heard his technique has to do with the soul, revealing that her earlier line was a bluff. She drives a nail into his head and activates resonance. Yuji sees Mahito react to this, immediately recognizing it as Nobara's technique. Using Mahito's body as the effigy in place of the straw doll for the straw doll technique, and Mahito's soul as the target, Nobara can use resonance to directly attack the main Mahito's soul. The damage dealt to the main Mahito then rebounds back to the clone as well. Realizing that Nobara has a way to directly attack his soul, Mahito immediately remarks that Yuji isn't his only natural enemy, as Nobara is as well. Nobara points out that between feeling her cursed energy detonate somewhere else nearby, the fact that Mahito doesn't seem to have much cursed energy, and the fact that he's had opportunities to touch her with his hand and end the fight, but instead merely attacked with shape-shifted limbs, she's come to the conclusion that he must be some kind of double that can't use his technique the same way as the original. Yuji capitalizes on the opening Nobara's resonance gave him, and begins just beating the ever-loving shit out of Mahito. For a moment, Yuji's resolve is bolstered as he feels encouraged at the thought of not being alone, being reminded he hasn't failed everyone yet, and still has people to fight for. As it seems he has Mahito on his heels, Nobara prepares herself for what she expects is the start of the real fight, when Mahito decides it's time to proceed to DEFCON 2. The clone darts off to rendezvous with his better half, and Nobara gives chase. She points out that she could just ignore him and proceed to B5F, but decides it could come back to bite them later if she lets him run amok. Suddenly, Mahito escapes Yuji's stunlock by splitting himself off into multiple little Mahi balls. Yuji decides he has to find the one with the core of the soul in it to finish him off, and notices one of the Mahi balls with a higher level of cursed energy. He squishes it, but Mahito escapes again, having used the cursed energy to trick Yuji before shifting back into his normal shape and running away. The two Mahitos converge on an underground hallway, and Yuji wonders if they're going to merge so Mahito can heal himself, but instead, they run past each other. Yuji and Nobara notice each other on opposite ends of the hallway, and Yuji tries to warn Nobara. Due to the real body acting as a blind spot and Nobara having lowered her guard from having fought the double, Mahito manages to land a touch to her left eye. Yuji dispatches the double with ease, while Mahito wonders if he can take Nobara out with one touch, unlike with Nanami. Then, we go on a trip with Nobara as her life flashes before her eyes. In her home village in 2009, when she was 6, she was playing Smash Bros with her friend and her friend's father. and she thinks about how she thought she was the only sane person in the village. We experience this flashback from the perspective of Fumi, a friend Nobata had made in the village when she was younger. Fumi had moved in from the city and was surprised by the differences in small town life, like how small the class at her elementary school was. She made friends with Nobata when Nobata wanted to trade backpacks with her. After that, she would go over to Fumi's house all the time and play Smash Bros. With her dad. Given the year, the fact that they're clearly playing on a Wii, and that they mention a Smash Ball, they're probably playing Brawl. Fumi remembers that Nobata didn't like the people in the village, and had said that because the village was so small, it was harder to remain strangers with the other villagers than to make friends with them. This harkens back to Nobata's statement to Yuji after the fight with Eso and Kechizu, that she sees herself as only having so many chairs at the table that is her life, and tends to be picky about who she offers those chairs to. Fumi thought at the time that it was actually a good thing to be more likely to make friends with the people in the village, but mentions that she came to understand Nobata's discomfort when an old lady in the village brought her red bean rice to, quote, celebrate her womanhood, unquote. Anyone who has lived in that small of a town can attest that sometimes it can be very uncomfortable how much the other people in town act like they're part of your family and know things about you that you haven't told them, such as bringing over a red-colored food after you get your period for the first time. This also further reinforces Nobata's attitude that there really should be a healthy distinction between stages of closeness that people respect between each other. All the people in a small town acting like a big family like that can easily lead to groupthink, cults, and shit like that. Anyway, Fumi remembers that Nobata would often say mature things, but then fall back to more childlike statements like saying she found a secret base she was going to live in from now on. Fumi thought that maybe her mother had influenced the way she spoke, but when Nobata introduced her to Saori, a teenager who had also moved to the village and lived in a big beautiful house, she came to understand where the influence on Nobata's language had come from. Though the two girls enjoyed Saori, it seemed as though the villagers did not enjoy her family. Over time, the house started experiencing incidents of vandalism, which led to Saori and her family leaving the village not long after. Fumi mentions that she couldn't remember anything about their goodbyes to Saori, except for Nobata's crying face, which she was surprised to see. She says that in June of 2018, Nobata went off to high school. She had to start late because her grandmother, who she inherited her technique from and had been educating her in Jujutsu up to that point, had resisted her decision to attend Jujutsu High. Nobata seemed cheerful at first on the day of her departure, and Fumi felt guilty for thinking that Nobata wouldn't cry for her like she did Saori, who they hadn't spoken about ever again after the day she left. Suddenly, Nobata spoke up and told Fumi that the next time they saw each other, they should make sure Saori was there too, and was clearly trying to keep herself together, which caused Fumi to tear up too. With the flashback over, we cut away to an office late at night. Saori is still working and looks tired AF. Japanese work culture, am I right? We stand in solidarity with the production staff of the anime here. She has a conversation with her coworker where she states that she thought she'd be in a better place, and thinks back to Nobata and Fumi and how she put on a bit of an act to impress them. She mentions that she didn't exchange contact info with them to avoid slowly losing contact with them over time, and hopes Nobata's doing well. Spoiler, she is not. We see a visual representation of those chairs in her life, and see as Yuji, Megumi, Gojo, Maki, Panda, and Toge take seats in her life. She looks to Fumi, separate from the others, thinks back to the promise they made, and apologizes for not being able to keep her promise. She tells Yuji to let everyone know that she thinks letting people into her life wasn't so bad, as Mahito's technique takes effect and blows the upper left quarter of her face off, with Yuji looking on in horror, and the episode ends. With the recap out of the way, let's go over the basic points of the plot. 1. As nice as the background on Nobata was, unfortunately the only thing to really take away from this episode and remember for the next is the ending. Nobata is down for the count, and now it seems to be just Yuji versus Mahito. Now let's get into some analysis. First, I want to go into a theory I have about Saori. It's not explicitly stated, but given the size of Saori's house, the fact that Fumi mentions that she always seemed to be home, and Saori mentioning to her coworker that her mother is into organic stuff and spirituality, I think that Saori comes from a family that is better off financially. Not so much so that she's a trust fund baby, of course, seeing as how she's working so late at 22 or so, but she also tells the coworker that they didn't move because of work. This to me seems to be a surefire sign that her family has some degree of wealth, to be able to move into such a nice big house on a whim for no reason other than being into organic stuff and spirituality. That's the kind of half-thought-out major action taken on a whim that only moneyed people can make. It would also explain why the villagers didn't take kindly to Saori and her family. Fumi mentioned that she always seemed to be home, which to me means she and her family were most likely not integrating into the local culture of the village, which would make it easy for the other residents to ostracize them and see them as dangerous outsiders or something of the like, especially if they had any degree of wealth, which already serves to make it easy to other people even in big cities. At first I thought maybe she was also being homeschooled, but looking into it, Japan doesn't allow homeschooling until middle school graduation. This goes back to the thing I talked about regarding Japan's education system, where technically high school is a private institution parents pay to send their children to, and that the compulsory education system in Japan only goes up through middle school, which ends for most people around age 14. Because high school is optional, it's perfectly legal to provide a homeschool education starting from that point for Japanese people. Saori mentions that she moved there in her second year of middle school, so she would have only been 13 and not yet able to be homeschooled. However, as we all know, if there's anyone who can circumvent laws and do something like homeschool their child before they're legally allowed to, it would be a family with a lot of money. It's also possible her family actually is for real big-time rich. But Saori works anyway out of some kind of disagreement with the idea of living off her parents' wealth or some kind of situation of that nature. The fact that her mother is into organic stuff and spirituality also seems like a rich person thing to me, since they seem to get into strange alternative medicine all the time. For evidence of this, see Steve Jobs and how he tried to fight his cancer with an extreme vegetarian diet. Spoiler, it didn't work. Or Gwyneth Paltrow and her company Goop. It could also, potentially, have been an oblique way of trying to imply that maybe Saori's mother was involved in the Jujutsu world. I'm hardcore focusing on the word spirituality here. And moved to the town because she knew about Nobata and her grandmother and had some sort of plans or something for them. After all, we saw how lucrative being a curse user can be with Toji. And the vandalism incidents were the villagers' way of trying to protect Nobata and her grandmother as natives of the village. Anyway, that's my read on the situation. Feel free to drop a comment with what you think, because I'm certain there's implications to the story that run deeper than what we're explicitly told. Next, let's offer Nobata the same treatment I gave Nanami last week. Interestingly, similar to how Nanami's defining character moment or experience seemed to have been his reaction to Yu's death, I would say that the defining moment for Nobata's life that shaped her personality going forward from that on and basically defined how we see her act in the course of this series would be Saori's departure from the village. With Nobata, she seemed to just naturally have an aversion to the way people around her acted in the remote village she grew up in, and so developed an attitude of preferring to keep people at arm's length so she could feel like she was exercising some kind of control over whether she was letting people into her life or not. As shown with the friendships she did have, she deeply cared for her friends, even if they forced their way into her life, like she said Yuji, Megumi, and Gojo had done. I think the imagery of her standing surrounded by empty chairs shows that she had a deep heart, with plenty of room still left for people to enter her life, and perhaps implying that her commitment to being so selective about the people she let in left her feeling somewhat lonely, thinking that she wanted more people in her life but not being able to find anyone up to snuff, so to speak. Perhaps there was also an element of Saori's departure from her life that left her feeling somewhat afraid to make deep connections, and led to her being so harsh and espousing such hardline beliefs for fear of the pain that would come when those people inevitably left, which you might notice is a recurring theme in this story. In a way, her idolization of Saori left her with such high standards for those who she would willingly select to let into her life and care about, that in the end, the only friends she had made were ones that were against her will. As a person with a similar personality and outlook, I can definitely confirm that it can end up with you being very lonely, even though you know that the alternative of just trying to become friends with anyone you meet wouldn't really end up much better for you, what with the high standards and all. Overall, much like Yuji, she seems to default to caring about people, and so her harsh and condescending front is probably more of an affectation to try and avoid running afoul of that tendency and coming to let people get too close to her too easily, which would lead to her getting hurt. This is further reinforced by how much she was obviously distraught when she thought Yuji had died, despite knowing him for such a short amount of time and outwardly maintaining otherwise. That's my read for Nobata. What's yours? Drop a comment if you have your own feelings about her. Lastly, let's go over the bonus pages for these chapters in the volume release of the manga. After chapter 123, we get a page from Akutami addressing how he borrowed the design for young Nobata from animator Hiramatsu Tadashi, who made the design for the first season of Jujutsu Kaisen. He mentions that he thinks that Nobata is, quote, actually cute, unquote, when Hiramatsu draws her. After chapter 124, we don't get a bonus page since that chapter was the end of volume 14. After chapter 125, the first chapter of volume 15, we get the first part of a mini-series on Akutami being educated on Gojo's technique. And that's my episode recap and story analysis for the 19th episode of the second season of Jujutsu Kaisen. YouTube has apparently started making the like button light up if the words thumbs up are used in the video, so let me know if it works and you see those pretty RGB lights under the video by giving it a click. I want to test and see if it happens for everybody or if it's like only for YouTubers who are big enough. Make sure to subscribe and turn on bell notifications if you want to be here as soon as possible each week as I put out new videos for each episode as it airs. And feel free to drop a comment with suggestions as to other videos you might like to see, such as character analysis videos or explanations. Thanks for watching.